One of the things that I've been interested in for a while now is the phenomenon of extremes. Extreme urbanization, extreme weather, extreme population. All these phenomena give us a different sense and understanding of how we as a school can really examine questions when they're not necessarily in their normative state, but they are really in a highly charged state.
So the rubric we constructed was one of extreme urbanism, because we felt looking at extreme conditions, whether they're in South Asia, India, Africa, or Latin America, in a sense begins to challenge the business as usual paradigms that exist, that students are otherwise equipped with, to look at cities, to look at problem solving in cities. And so identifying Mumbai as one of those conditions of extreme urbanism, where the poor, the rich live in adjacencies that are unimaginable, the densities are so incredibly high, the lack of resources, the in-migration, the demographic shifts, the kind of temporal landscapes that make the city a kinetic landscape, all made it a fabulous lab for us to situate one of these extreme urbanism studios in. The way we structured the studio was not identify the problem or set up a brief and say this is what the site would need to get transformed by. But what we did was present the site. We identified a condition in Mumbai which was emblematic and representative of these extreme forms of urbanism that we were interested in. In many ways, the problem that we gave the students was a wicked problem where a solution only leads to other problems. So there's no real finite or ultimate solution. The solution of one aspect of the problem opens up a Pandora's box with other questions. And so it becomes a terrain of problems that slip around while you try to grapple them. It's a site which is contested from the perspective that it's an unfinished piece of landfill historically, and the city has aspirations to fill that land because now real estate values are very high. And on this extremely high real estate are really poor people and the wealthiest in the country. They're people who occupy office buildings, residential buildings, the World Trade Centers are there, and there's an ancient fishing village. And so the students were charged with understanding the site, understanding the actors, the constituencies that had aspirations for the site, and then to construct their own reading of the problem, and then to respond to that construction of the problem with a design solution. So the site visit to Mumbai was a very important part of the kind of pedagogical frame of the studio, because the idea there was in the 10 days that we were as a large group in Mumbai to expose the students and all the participants of the studio not only to the extreme conditions in the city, but to expose them to the scale of the metropolis, to the varied worlds that occupy the city.
One of the highlights of the trip was a walk through Dharavi, and to get a sense of the extreme conditions that exist in a place like this gives you an incredible sense of the reality of the lives of those people who are living and working within very tight circumstances. One can be so inspired by the resilience of the citizens. People in the context of Dharavi have discovered certain things in terms of how to live, which is very difficult for us as designers to imagine being possible.
To expose the students to different people, we organized a conference for a day where speakers were as varied as government officials to practicing architects and urban planners to ordinary citizens. We sort of exposed the students to places to eat, to ride on the train, to walk the streets, to basically understand how many extremely different worlds occupy the same space, but in very close proximity. And I think if there's anything that characterizes Mumbai, it's that the adjacencies are very bizarre of what sits next to something else. Often many worlds exist in many cities, but they exist in different spaces. I think the uniqueness about Mumbai is that all these different worlds exist in the same space. The solutions range from acupuncture-like strategies to projects that went to the other extreme of representing what might be Mumbai's translation of an aspiration to become global, and where architecture became the central spectacle of the city. This sort of range had many, many other solutions poised in between, which included strategies of landscape to projects that focused on very specific and pragmatic questions of housing. What was interesting about Robert and Hafiz's project was it was a brave one, it was an ambitious one. It took as its starting point the fact that there is this aspiration in the city to be very global. They recognized the city commands the world's highest real estate, and what would the expression, what would be the urban form that might emerge from this. And being a partnership between an urban design and architect and a student from the business school was dynamite, because they could not only draw this up deftly as an imagination of what could be, but they had the numbers, they had the financial models, they had everything that needed to back it up as an argument. Jayu's project brought a really refreshing sensibility to the studio, because what she did was she used the flows of nature in terms of tides, silting processes, etc., to construct a landscape over a period of 10 years. And she worked very closely with one of the Loeb fellows, Herbert, who has expertise in the management of water systems and natural landscapes. And so she constructed an imagination of a landscape in this contested bay that would become the mediator, so to speak, for the varied constituencies that occupy that space. And it would become a productive landscape for the fisher folks, it would become parks for the kids in the buildings, it would become a recreational place for people who work in the offices, and it used public space as a kind of neutralizing instrument. Teresa picked up an old tradition that exists in activism with slums, which is to look at slum upgradation through the intervention of urban infrastructure. And she was mentored by Brian Bell, who's a design advocate, and the combination of her design sensibilities in terms of intervening in a slum and Brian partnering and questioning her about implementation and strategic policies to make this happen made for a very, very rich project, which had minimal interventions, but ones that could resonate in really powerful ways. Marta and Jean-Pierre's project picked up on plans that the Nariman Point Association already has, and it understood this moment in the city where investment in infrastructure is given a lot of premium. And it's easy today in the city to generate funds or to harness funds to create infrastructural projects. And so they kind of extended an existing project with the Nariman Point Association, understood it, researched it, and came up with a proposition which satisfied the government's aspiration of providing big infrastructure and parking, but also creating beautiful public space. Justin and Angel's project really came out of the discussions that we had as a group with the National Center of Performing Arts, and they understood that it was critical to make the National Center of Performing Arts a more public kind of enterprise, that it needed to be reconfigured architecturally to open up to the waterfront. And so by adding that dimension of public space, they suddenly showed us how the center could be transformed and embrace the city in more real ways. So any condition of extreme urbanism obviously is a very complex one, because it has multiple forces, multiple aspirations, political constituencies, all acting on the same urban space. This necessarily had to be an interdisciplinary studio because it needs multiple lenses to discern the problem before you start constructing solutions. We thought that it would be critical to expose students to that interdisciplinary format because those will be the conditions they'd work in if they become planners and they get engaged with cities like this. So we included the Loeb Fellows, who are mid-career professionals. We included the Business School, we included the Real Estate Initiative, and we included the Kennedy School of Government.
We are very careful about the balance between what we would call disciplinary practices and transdisciplinary practices. There are certain things we need to do, but we really need to go in depth within a discipline, and then there are certain moments when it's absolutely essential for us to work with other entities, other parts of the university and other disciplines. And I think Rahul has done an incredible job to really bring so many different people together, and that has, in a sense, created a kind of event.
An interesting component in the studio was the participation of the Loeb Fellows. Their agenda, the betterment of cities, is mapped on with ours. The diversity within the Loeb Fellows ranges all the way from people who've experience in publication, to art, to preservation, to design advocacy, to planning, to transportation. The Loebs became not only mentors for the students, but they became friends and they participated in all the discussions, I think adding a very rich voice in the process. The challenge when you set up an interdisciplinary studio is that the culture of each of the colleges and the schools within the university are so different. They speak different languages, but more than that, they bring different values to the discussion. We avoided the formal approaching of school to school kinds of situations and rather reached out to teachers in these different places that we thought would be sympathetic to a learning experience like this for their own students. And so it was really the professors from the School of Business, the Kennedy School, the Real Estate Initiative, Rick Pizer, Tony Gomez, Urbanism, and Nick Retsinas, who came together with me and we began to construct how a studio like this would occur. We started off in the first review with the students actually challenging each other, speaking different languages, and bringing completely different values to bear on the problem. By the second review, they were beginning to get sympathetic, and you could see they were getting attracted by each other's solutions and perceptions.
I'm not sure how it came up. It was kind of like, I guess the fact that we both speak Spanish, and we started talking, and we thought it would be cool to do something. It was very smooth moment. It was not something that we were both of us obliged to do. So it became something very kind of like, okay, I think you have it. He was happy with my presentation and midterm, and we talked about it. So we thought it would be a good moment to start doing something together.
Because they were all immersed in the site, that is, in the trip to Mumbai together, on the ground, looking at a problem, experiencing a problem, is, I think, the deepest form of some kind of commonality of values being established. And I think that is when the real team formation happened, although it got formalized much later.
Before Mumbai, we were all separate entities, all the divisions, the HBS, the KSG, all of them. And then at that point, the sort of Mumbai trip being the sort of turning point, we were supposed to, the studio students, have a design in mind. And then with that in mind, there was supposed to be this sort of, if it worked, if there was sort of a alignment of interest that these partnerships would form.
I am an architect and Justin is, of course, a real student, so we're trying to combine our strengths.
And the truth is that none of the professors forced teams to happen. The teams happened because something a student said resonated with another student, and they reached out, and we created the format within which they could reach out.
We had very similar sensibilities. It wasn't just going to be a design project. It was going to be something that could be done.
She already had this formative idea of this bar that would have all of the major programs on it. And I already had some ideas about what might be feasible from a financial perspective.
By the third time we met, they'd already established partnerships, and they were beginning to, present as partners, and they were beginning to support each other.
We never forced the other one to do something. At least he didn't force me to change my design because of the numbers, how feasible the project would be. We found other solutions, like doing some offices in certain parts or residential towers in other parts, so that my whole idea would be more powerful and sustainable and feasible.
I came over to the School of Design, Robert came over to the business school, so it wasn't that there was one main school that was at the kind of like the center of what we were doing.
When I told her that her bar cost $1 billion, you should have seen the look on her face. But perhaps she hadn't stopped to realize just the magnitude.
I don't think, but that's the amazing thing about being back in school, that you deal with projects that are totally not out of scale, because they're not out of scale, things like that happen, but you will never do a project like this in an office during a month. It's like a 3-year project with 1,000 million consultants and it's very, very complex. And now where you're facing a project of this type and you have to like take decisions and make numbers and make a design in a month and a half, it's like, wow. So yeah, I was surprised by the value of my project. But we win money, right?
The project is feasible from a financial perspective.
Which I call it winning money.
And the fourth presentation, they were speaking for each other and they were speaking in one voice, which was really fascinating.
I've had a pretty much business sensibility, and this allowed me to see things a slightly different way than I would have thought about it. Also, going into the real world, I now have a friend in Robert that I can reach out to, and when I start thinking about crazy ideas, I can have somebody articulate it from a design perspective.
If I had been doing this alone, I would have never considered aesthetic priorities, social considerations, the wealth of little moments that occur all along the program that happen to enrich and embellish, and I think that's something positive that came out of the collaboration.
There's a little comment. I heard the dean say something that he couldn't tell which student was the business school student, which student was the GSD student. Someone said that, and I hope that's true, because I think that really speaks to how well we meshed as a group.
One of the things that's really productive and very exciting about the way in which the collaboration has happened is the fact that this has been organized by the students, and it's really a bottom-up form of organization that doesn't need so much the help and support of the faculty to organize things, but it's actually the motivations are orchestrated amongst the student body, and it's that really leads to very exciting possibilities for us in the years to come.
The extreme urbanism studios or labs, in a sense, are set up in ways that we would engage with the city for 3 years, because we feel a period like that allows you to really get under the skin of the city and actually begin to not only provoke a serious discussion about the city, but also to create a kind of give back, both in terms of sharing with the city the ideas that get generated from the studio, the resources that get generated from the studio, in terms of data, in terms of patterns, in terms of analysis, but also to give back in the way of capacity building in some form. And so one of the important components of the studio was doing a workshop in Mumbai where our faculty interacted with local professionals. And we hope to formalize that much more as we go along.
This model of multi-year studios is also something that we hope will be linked to the practice of studios abroad, where the students will actually be living in a particular part of the world. We have so many exciting things happening here at the GSD. At the same time, the opportunity to work with important practitioners on site for a 3-month period seems to be also an exciting way of conducting studios that we should try and think about.
It's very critical in the training of an urban planner to recognize the global south, or what's also called now the majority world. Our students, as they graduate, even our American students, are going to be employed all over the world, and they probably be employed much quicker in India and China than they would be in the United States, at least in the next decade or two, because this is where the action is, this is where the projects are happening, this is where cities are growing, and so it's our responsibility really as an institution to train them with instruments, with tools, with mechanisms by which they can understand these problems. What characterizes Mumbai really is that architecture is not the only spectacle by which the city represents its own aspirations. A major part of the city is a kind of temporal landscape in flux. And that landscape is the seeming chaos which images seem to convey to us. But there's a kind of order there. And there is a kind of grain. The city is at a much finer grain than what you find in the West. And this exposure itself to another kind of urbanism, I think for the students was very educative, because it challenged all their perceptions of what cities should be or what cities are supposed to be. But this is where a majority of the world's population lives, in cities like this. And so it's critical for their education to be exposed to these conditions, to be able to articulate and have the ability to make sense of conditions like this, which are, just extremely different from what they imagine.